I have a new title. Perhaps it will appear. So I should start, as some other people have done, with a couple of caveats. I am not a Ukrainianist, and unlike Jesse, I don't even have the benefit of working in comparative mode on another country invaded by Russia. So I do Yugoslavia and general questions of international law. And so that's the second caveat is I'm going to be speaking today from an international legal perspective. In my experience, perhaps not this choir, but sometimes it requires a slight sort of contextual explanation when I'm dealing with social science crowds, what I mean. I should stress that when I say I'm talking about law, I do not mean something doctrinal, as sometimes one gets from lawyers, but much more to think about law as an instrument through which we express power and politics, and the instrument that we use to legitimize power. In this sense, or to express shared values, I'm very much in the mode of the other thing I study, which is international relations, someone like E.H. Carr, who spends an awful lot of time in his seminal work on realism talking about law. So I put myself in that vein. Maybe the other way to think about it is we've had some excellent discussions about the importance of terminology, and if you're one of those people who thinks that it's analytically and even normatively important to have the right terminology, then you're thinking very much the same way I do about the importance of law. When we talk about things like the importance of whether this is or is not a civil war, this has legal implications as well. So, as I say, my perspective is international law, and I'm going to be talking, therefore, about the particular example of Ukraine as an example of a general problem. So briefly about three different, various exciting ways of failing to express power legitimately, right? To be both effective and legitimate, all of which I suggest are somehow related to and enabled by a systemic failing in international law to get the balance between power and ideals correct. So I'll start with the proximate actor, what Lucan called the villain in the story, which is Russia, and I would conceptualize Russia's role as what I call blinding power. Russia's behavior has been obviously illegal. I should note I'll be happy in the discussion to explain why that's not actually so clear at all. I've written something on how deeply problematic it is to say that it's illegal, but between you and me, it clearly is. You might compare it to Georgia. I've written something on this. The one thing I've written on that, Russia's behavior in Georgia is plausibly defensible, and here I would say it is implausibly defensible, right? If we think about the norms on use of force, there's basically three ways you can use violence across borders. The Security Council has to approve it. It could be an action of self-defense, or this problematic category of humanitarian intervention. My quick legal analysis is no, no, and no. It's just clearly not the case. But what Russia's behavior has been is extremely effective, right? This is power without legitimacy. And what I wanted to suggest here, so I can move along, is what this has done is distract us in thinking about the broader legal and political frame of this. In other words, the blinding illegality, the flagrant illegality of Russia's actions has offered us a very easy answer to what is actually a very complex set of questions. And when I say complex, I'm talking about the role of the separatists. What is their identity? What are their purposes? How should we think about them as actors who have some power and perhaps claims about legitimacy? And I would characterize them in a sense as the flaw in their performance as the over-hasty use of borrowed power. The borrowed power obviously is Russia's, right? We've had much discussion about the proxy nature of this war. It's clearly, obviously, in many respects generated by Russia, initiated perhaps. And that flagrant illegality of Russia, in a sense, taints the actions of the separatists and dismisses them. We've heard them described as proxies, right? Proxies for an illegal power. I think also here we might consider, what was it, Jennifer's discussion of the dehumanizing rhetoric, right? This is a way of dismissing these as illegitimate actors. They certainly have not helped themselves in terms of legitimacy through their precipitous action. Monica just spoke about the importance of process or procedure, and the legitimizing moves of the separatists have been incredibly defective. If we think about the complete failure to in any way engage with the Ukrainian constitutional structures, this has not, especially in the East, been a long-standing set of complaints brought forth to the Rada and denied, and then finally, desperately, a resort to the help of the neighbors. But as someone mentioned, a month-long collapse of the state is seen as a quick opportunity. And we see this best if we look at the defective nature of the referenda, right? Both in Crimea and in the East. The context is such that it is not possible to ask a a meaningful question, or expect rather a meaningful answer. And even in Crimea in particular, the question is defective, right? It didn't actually allow a status quo result, so it doesn't allow us as outside actors to accept its legitimacy in any way. That doesn't mean there's not a basis there. I think many people have noted that if you had had a fair referendum in Crimea, you might have gotten a similar answer. This is obviously contested. We've heard many views on this. I've just noted a couple that people mentioned during this conference. Serhi was talking about the ethnic underlay of the support for secession in different areas. Keith mentioned the discontent in Crimea. We've heard also the claim about the non-ethnic economic relationship of Donbass to Moscow, right? So other reasons why there might be a detachment from Kiev. I mean, many people, of course, have spoken about what plausibly is true, patterned, consistent alienation of populations in the south and the east from their own government in Kiev. So there is clearly some muddled, confused basis for this alienation. My point, however, is the borrowed nature of the power deployed by the separatists has, in a sense, allowed Kiev and us to not take them seriously as legitimate actors. They are factors of power that one regrettably has to deal with and nothing more. That's the way they've been perceived. This brings me to the third actor, one we don't normally think of as having a lot of power here, which is Kiev, but I would frame them as, shall we say, engaging in lawful inaction, right? The power to do nothing. So if we look at what Ukraine has done over the period of its independence, I think Lucan referred to this as a Faustian bargain, relatively minimal engagement with this growing alienation, which is present from the beginning and clear to many people. Certainly, as was mentioned, right, Eastern elites have been incorporated into the rapacious state, well done, but not really a response to this alienation as such. If you look at, for example, Ukraine's constitution, it actually bars both 96 and 2004, I forget the numbers, Articles 72 and 73, require the Rada to approve any referendum, and if that referendum pertains to territory, it must be an all-Ukrainian referendum. Right? There are legitimate reasons for doing this, but clearly this is about doing the math and guaranteeing that no such referendum could ever pass. Right? So the Ukrainian legal system is structured to prevent legitimate engagement with such questions, assuming you wanted to. It provides no pathway to peaceful change of this kind. And here I would, again, refer to someone like Carr for the proposition that if you do not provide peaceful pathways for change, you can expect the other kind. But this is where I come to my theme. Ukraine doesn't have to offer any peaceful pathways to change because the international legal regime in which it is a member doesn't require this, and in fact, if you really think about its structure, strongly enables this kind of lawful inaction, right? International law does not require this sort of thing. It actually, through its extremely strong commitment to territorial integrity, provides very strong incentives to ignore this kind of alienation inside the state. Also, if you think this, I work a lot on self-determination. This is commonly thought of as somehow a challenge to territorial integrity, but if you really think about the way we have applied or defined self-determination since 1945, this is anti-Wilsonianism. It is the right of a people to govern themselves within predefined territorial units, right? And if you think about how that actually works as a logic, in almost all circumstances, it is lockstep with territorial integrity. What it does is provide a seeming moral underlay to the principle or the rule of territorial integrity. So what I want to suggest is that what we have is an extremely strong commitment to territorial integrity, so much so that it is, shall we say, highly idealized. We commit to this as a global rule in all circumstances, right? The integrity of the state to be preserved regardless of its functionality, regardless of the actual substantive wishes of its own population. And I would add, idealized in the sense that, as we have recently seen on the eastern Ukrainian steppes, it is a commitment that is completely unmatched to power in many cases. In this case, certainly. There is a commitment to an ideal that we are not prepared to back up with power, unable to realistically. It's not clear that it's actually a stabilizing norm either. Again, if you think about eastern Ukraine, it's not clear that it has done that kind of work. And especially, I wish to stress here, there are two kinds of territorial integrity norms. One regards external interventions, right, an anti-aggression norm. I like this rule, I think we ought to keep it. The other part is the one that's problematic, which is the defense of states' integrity against their own populations, right? The internal component of territorial integrity, thank you. And this is not clear that it actually produces stability inside populations. Rather, it produces contestations for control of the entire state, an all or nothing contest. And on the idealizing end, or the ideal end of this, the spectrum, I think if you reflect upon territorial integrity as a rule, it's a fairly hollow rule. It doesn't really have a lot of moral content of its own, right? It is preserving units that we happen to have. It's a proxy for some other values that better have some substance if we're to commit to them. So what does this imply in 1 minute and 52 seconds? You could think about this as an historical question. Might things have come out differently? Might we have reached a different dispensation, or even the detachment of Crimea without external intervention, had we engaged in some internal constitutional process of allowing change at some point in the last 25 years. I'll leave that to the side and rather look, as lawyers like to do, at policy rather than the past. If you think about our global community's current policy on Ukraine, it is well, there are whispers in the halls about the possible need to admit a thing that we cannot, right? That we're not going to get Crimea back for Ukraine, right? And so therefore the question quietly is, how could you make this go away or paper it over? That this is, in other words, a grudging act of realism. We cannot remake the norm as we want, so how can we do it? I'd like to suggest a cheerful embrace of this kind of realism, because it might be a reformation of the borders of Ukraine might actually make more sense both on realist and idealist grounds. And just briefly to say what I would mean. If our goal is to stabilize the Ukrainian state's frontiers, it might better be done with different ones than were in place before the crisis. Again, just to look at the events of the last year, evidently these are not defensible frontiers. If our goal, as some people talked about, is to consolidate the Maidan Ukrainian state, to consolidate a national unit with a shared sense of values and move it towards the West, this clearly would be easier with the, shall we say, little national project rather than the larger one. Easier without millions of alienated people inside the population. No time left. Can I just say my last sentence? Okay. And as an ideal, it might, difficult as it might be for Ukrainian nationalists to say, for those of us who aren't, it might be better for those alienated populations if they were in a state that they preferred to be in. Let me just close by pointing out one of the objections you will have. It is dangerous to change borders. Look what's happening in Ukraine, right? I would propose an alternate way of understanding this. What is happening in Ukraine is what comes from not changing borders in time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.